Welcome to the FYI on Youth Ministry, a youth ministry podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute, and a podcast that you can watch on the Fuller Youth Institute YouTube channel. This season is all about the 7 transitions of young adulthood, and in this episode, we're talking about the self-identifying transition. Steve Argue is the lead researcher in this project and our in-house young adult expert. Steve will be coming back in each of the episodes. He's going to give us a quick overview of each of the transitions in the beginning of the episodes, and he's going to come back towards the end of the episodes for a wrap-up conversation with me. My name is Roslyn Hernandez. I am the podcast producer at FYI, and I'm going to be your host for this season. And in each episode, we'll be hearing from several young adults sharing their own experience with each of the transitions. For this episode on the self-identifying transition, we have Raye, Esteban, Laura, Ethan, and Christian. But first, here is Steve with an overview of the self-identifying transition.
Okay, in this season, we want to talk about young adults and transitions. And in this particular session, we want to talk about the self-identifying transition. Ways to think about this is who I'm becoming in all its complexity and intersectionality. Think about your identity for a second. It's more than just one thing. It's quite complex. And this is incredibly important for young adults who are finally at the point in their late teens, moving into their early 20s, where their brain is developing all the way to 25. Psychologically, their ego is getting strong enough where they're able to self-reflect on their lives, and they begin to ask this question in deep and profound ways. Well, who am I? Who am I based on my gender or my orientation or my race or my ethnicity, or my socio-economic status, or my religious upbringing, or the place that I grew up in this world? All these factors contribute to answering this question for a young adult: who am I? And what a young adult is trying to do in this self-identifying transition is to harmonize these multiple identities, this intersectionality, in a way that allows them to faithfully say, this is who I am. A lot of times adults want to identify young adults with just one of their identities rather than recognizing the fact that young adults are trying to harmonize all of them. And so you can imagine the work that goes into that, the attention that young adults must give to that as they begin to negotiate all of these identities to make sense for themselves.
As we heard from Steve, young adults are thinking about a lot of different aspects of their identities. Here is Raye reflecting on some of the external and internal identities that he's had to negotiate.
I love the balance of internal and external selves. It's a little bit of like my story. I was born and raised in San Gabriel Valley here in Los Angeles. I'm Asian American. My parents are Taiwanese. So that's a big part of the internal story that I've been piecing together in the last couple of years especially. And I think recognizing for myself, my story is one that is Asian American, that is Taiwanese American. And in the past couple of years, putting the pieces together to differentiate and distinguish what is my particular story, separate from other Americans who live this life and separate from even my own family who can see that I'm Taiwanese, but my experiential reality really indicates to me that this is very different than anything my family can talk about. And all these are still moving pieces. I'm still making sense of all of them as they come, and there's always something new that I'm digging through and working through and presenting before God to show me his truth. I think growing up Asian and then in our current society, there's very much this focus, this performative track that you have to go on to fulfill these things, and life has to look this certain way. And I think I was on that for a little bit and slowly taking a step back to recognize, okay, who am I? What are my passions and curiosities? And I think in all those things that family, or I felt the pressure, expectation from family or society, I did my best to fit myself within the quadrant of what was expected or acceptable. But I realized even as I did that, I was like, okay, I still feel really trapped and caged in. And a lot of differentiation work happened there.
Race, ethnic, racial, and cultural identities are external identities that have been part of his story his whole life. But sometimes external identities can be temporary, like a stage of life. These external changes can trigger internal identity changes as well. When we talked to Esteban, he described part of his identity transition in this way.
I don't know, maybe this is what a quarter life crisis is, but I've been feeling like I just feel old, 28, like it just hit me. Last year, like I think about why last year I wasn't thinking of the fact that I'm way closer to 30, but now it hits me. I'm thinking of my parents all the time. Like they're so old now. Well, they're not old, but I think about that and, I just start like feeling like more caring. You get me? I'm considered a young adult now, not a youth. There was a moment where that just happened and I didn't really realize it. And in my head, I'm still, this 18-year-old kid.
Like we heard from Esteban, growing up and feeling more responsibility can be surprising, external and internal identity transitions. But making the conscious decision to get married is an external transition that causes young adults to negotiate part of their identity again. Here is a reflection from Laura about how being newly married has influenced a change in her identity.
Well, so I was at dinner with my husband and I asked him the same question, like, how do you think that you've changed from identifying yourself now that you're married? As we were talking, I think I kind of realized it's not in abstract moments that I'm thinking about my identity as a wife, but it's in smaller moments. For example, I was hanging out with a friend at a coffee shop on Saturday. She invited me to hang out with her later that evening. And I hadn't seen my husband in 4 or 5 days because he was at a work conference. And so in that moment, I had to then also think about my new identity as a wife and think about, okay, well, I haven't seen him in quite a few days and this is my priority, and having to shift that and change that, because my single self, I probably would have been oh yeah, I will just sacrifice the things that I need to get done later on. But now I think my identity is impacted the way that I make choices more than it had previously.
Some young adults become parents when they are in their 20s, and this might be as a couple with their spouse or as single parents. Then these external identities can trigger another time of transition as young adults work out what kind of parents they want to be. Ethan is one of these young adults who went through an identity transition as parenthood became part of his identity.
Yeah, I would say this is, you don't recommend this to everybody. Your sort of description is not prescription, I would say. But I got married at 19 and that's actually worked out really great for me. But I think I got sort of crossed into the line of responsibility faster than I thought. We were not planning on having children. And again, no TMI, but we were preventing and this just happened. And so I think I found myself crossing those lines, feeling incredibly out of my depth. I was just I'm barely getting my life together, let alone ready to give my life away to small humans that will rely on me for every basic need. For me, there was an incredible hardship and it felt as all of my friends were in this space of they're traveling. They're experiencing autonomy at a different level for the first time in their life often, right? They're out of college, they're finished. I was 22 when we had our first kid. Even as all my friends are finding themselves out of the gravitational pull of college that pulled us together into independent things that they felt great agency in, I'm facing a limitation that I love in a child. And also navigating the fact that I don't have a ton of peers in my age category. Having a child at 22 is not in everybody's 5-year plan when they're 18. So for me, I really had to tether myself to being a student of the wisdom of other people around me. I actually during that time, okay, this sounds so dumb. I made myself a syllabus for parenting because I was brand new. I did not know. And I said, here are like 10 to 12 people who I've seen parent in a way that year over year feels like an appreciating asset. Like they are not so attached to their kid's identity that they can't be an energetic, like generative human being, nor are they so passive in their parenting that their kids have been the casualties of their other pursuits. And just essentially talk with them about what are milestones you've observed, what are some pain points that you've experienced? Literally, how did you function in your career on less sleep when you're brand new?
So these are just a few of the ways in which young adults are experiencing changes in their identities throughout their 20s. We encourage you to listen and to be open to hearing the other ways in which young adults around you might be going through their own identity transitions. When we asked what advice they would give adults who are accompanying young adults, or what advice they would give their young adult peers, this is what Raye and Christian shared.
This whole like life process that we're all in, that is just transition and stability, destabilizing and restabilizing. And that's just like an ongoing process that we continue through. So I guess to answer your question more explicitly, Roslyn, it's just for other young people to know that they're not alone, and like we're not alone in this process. And being alone doesn't mean we get all the answers right away. It means we still need to wrestle through the hard things, and a lot of times living in tension and uncertainty. But just to know that in the process, we're not alone.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like one of the other things that I wish more young people would hear, whether that be from their parents or their youth leaders or young adult leaders or pastors or whoever, is just like the overwhelming love of God, and that it's not like the love that we see from people. That like it's not your identity and your value are not tied up in the things that the world tells you that they're tied up in, but that your identity is in Christ and your value is secure in Him. And it gives you the freedom to say that my identity and my value is not tied up in the amount of money that I make or the kind of job that I have or whatever else that I'm doing.
Ethan, who is not just a young adult himself, but is also a youth leader, shared this piece of advice with us.
I think one of the most practical things youth leaders can do would probably be to write down the assumptions that you have about the ways that that person needs to grow. And then check yourself when you're trying to bend a person towards your assumptions instead of what arises from empathy. I think all of us end up, and to some degree, allowing our biography to be a prescription on someone else. And our assumptions, if left unchecked, can actually cause us to minister to stereotypes instead of people. And so I think one of the hugest things that we can do is before we meet with people, to identify what are the biases that we have that we think they need. And then to try to consciously, for me, there's sometimes I, as a youth leader or a young adult leader, will write that down and then have them on a 3x5 and tuck it away as a way of reminding myself in the moment. These are assumptions that if I don't put them away, will get in the way of actually hearing a person's real life. And then second, write down questions, specific, maybe lanes of curiosity, that if you share questions that press into those lanes may help you get in touch, not with what you think a person needs, but with what they're articulating keeps them awake at night.
Volunteers are essential for your ministry, but finding and retaining good volunteers can be a challenge. We know. Join our online training event and we'll equip you with quality, research-based tips and tools from FYI experts on recruiting, training, and retaining youth ministry volunteers for discipleship impact. The training will take place on Tuesday, September 24th. And you can register and find more information at fulleryouthinstitute.org/volunteer. Now, let's go to my wrap-up conversation with Steve. Hi, everyone. Steve is back.
Hey, hi.
Yes, so we are listening to the young adults. Everything that they're saying is so great.
Yeah.
But I know that there's more range to the stories that came from the research. That's why we're having this time to talk a little more about what else was in the research. So for the transition of self-identifying, Steve, what other stories came up in there?
Yeah, so exciting. So maybe one of the ways that we could think about this is I think that young adults are kind of going through this transition of hearing you ought to be or you are to them embracing I am, right? So notice what's happening there. You have the external challenges to the internal owning. And I think that that's a really challenging thing because the external is important to us, right? Our communities, where we've come from, and all that comes with that. So we don't want to let anybody down. A young adult doesn't want to betray where they've come from or whatever. But at the same time, they're making sense of themselves as well. So I think we've heard this a lot in the research with regards to, well, how do I show up as in my family? Who do people see me as, and who do I want to put myself out to be? How will they react to that? So the tension of declaring who I am with whom is really interesting. Yeah. Sometimes I think what they found is that sometimes it's easier to share who I am with a stranger than with somebody that's close family, right? And so I think a sensitivity to that is really, really important. I think also we heard sometimes is sort of this wrestling in spiritual realms of like, well, I know you have all these identities, but your identity is in Christ.
Oh, yes.
Right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. And which is yes, but
it's not
yes,
always helpful.
Right. It's yes and, right?
Yeah, right.
Jesus doesn't cover up our multiple identities that we're harmonizing. Jesus amplifies all of who God has created us to be. And so to hear young adults try to articulate that in a way that's deeply beautiful and deeply spiritual, I think was really, really helpful as well. And so I think when we think about ministry, I think that the impulse sometimes with adults is we're looking for the right answers for young adults to give us because we want to feel better about who they are, right?
Right.
But it's in these spaces that maybe we can ask. When someone says, well, this is who I am, we could say to them, that's really beautiful. And what else? Right? And allow the space for them to slowly show you the multifaceted aspect of who they are. Because I know this, we all do this, right? If I ask you who you are, you will tell me who you are at the safest level. And then you'll see if we can go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper.
It reminds me of that Shrek quote where he says, like, I'm like an onion. I have layers.
Yes.
But I think, I also think about like a diamond, right? A diamond is cut in like various different ways.
Yeah.
And sometimes from a perspective, you see one facet or one side of the diamond and it reflects something. But from another angle, there are other sides, right? Like people are complicated. Right. There's so many layers and intersections to who we are. And young adults are like in the midst of realizing all of those layers and those intersections.
I love the diamond analogy because I think sometimes we choose as parents or as leaders to only look at young adults through one angle rather than turning it, right? We found this really interesting as well. I find that young adults oftentimes have a difficult time declaring who they are because I think there's an element of maybe insecurity or humility, or they don't want to come across as saying like, I'm really good at this. But I find that their friends will say, you know what you're really good at. You know what I really appreciate about you. So maybe another way from a ministry perspective is we can say, well, what do your friends say about you? Or, how would you describe your friends? And I think sometimes it allows them to have permission to open up about their multifaceted selves so that they can really embrace this self-identifying transition that they're working through.
Yeah, so let's make it very easy and clear for folks that are listening. What are maybe 2 things that you would recommend for an adult or a youth ministry leader or a young adult, even if they're talking to another young adult, one of their friends? Like ways to engage in conversations with them. You already mentioned some of them, or things to do. Any tips for, engaging this self-identifying transition with young adults?
I think what I've said before, I think that and what else question is really, really great. Let's not be satisfied with one way that a young adult describes themselves. And I think that would be really, really great. I think sometimes too, the impulse with young adults is that they feel like they're reporting to an adult when they ask questions. So sometimes stories are really great. Okay. So tell me a story that makes you you. Like, I think those type of things help us appreciate the multifaceted identity that they have, and it begins to make them comfortable to talk about that. And then I say the last thing, and this isn't very practical, but it's really, really important. I think we just have to give it time. The onion layers that you talked about before, right? This isn't one conversation. Like, think about getting to know a young adult over 10 conversations. Yeah. I think there's an element of trust that comes with us revealing ourselves to each other that's part of this as well. And I think the young adults that we talked with really resonated with the people in their lives that gave them space, and they learned to trust to open up. And I think that becomes really important as well.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that. And that's all we have for you today, folks. Remember, let's keep learning from each other. We want to know what your questions are. We want to know what you think. If you're a young adult, if you're a youth leader, leave your questions and your comments in the YouTube comments section, and let us know, how you're learning along with us. And also remember to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell button, and give us a like. See you in the next one. This podcast is one of the many free resources produced by the Fuller Youth Institute. And speaking of free resources, if you're really liking the content that you're hearing in this season, we want to hook you up with a really helpful resource. It's a guide titled 7 Things You Need to Know for Successful Young Adult Ministry. This guide covers the transitions that we're talking about in the season, but it also gives you practical questions to help you engage young adults in your ministry. You can download this guide at youngadultministrynext.com. Lastly, you can watch this episode on the Fuller Youth Institute YouTube channel. And thanks so much for watching or listening.